I have a past. You have a past. I have done some things in my life that I'm not proud of, and my guess is that's probably the same case with you, that you look back on your life and maybe some things you did when you were a teenager, maybe some things you did if you're a teenager when you were a preteen that you're going, why in the world did I do that? Some things that we're ashamed of in our past. And the thing about our past is a lot of times we like to think we can clean up our own mess. But the reality is we're more like that toddler who sees his mom slaving away, working away, trying to clean the kitchen. He goes, you know what? I'm going to help my mom out. So he goes and finds a rag and he gets it wet. And he starts to wipe down all the kitchen cabinets, every single last one of them. He's so proud of himself because he's helping his mom clean the kitchen cabinets. Meanwhile, the mom is sitting there going, wait a second here. I have a toddler. Where in the world is my toddler getting a rag wet? Because toddlers can't reach the sink quite yet. And so she follows her toddler back to the bathroom and watches as her toddler puts the rag in the toilet and proceed to wipe down the kitchen cabinets. The toddler was so proud of himself because he's helping his mom clean the kitchen. I'm doing such a great job. But so often when we have a mess in our life, we're like that toddler. We think we are doing such a great job in cleaning up that mess, but the reality of the situation is we're just making an even bigger mess. But here in Mark chapter 5, we see today, that'll be our main text today, we see that Jesus has the power to clean up the mess. And that's one of the things we see throughout the Gospel of Mark, up in our study of the Gospel of Mark to this point, is that we see Jesus' power over and over and over again. And so today we're just going to zero in on 3 examples of Jesus' power and what those examples or those demonstrations of his power mean for us today. Because when Jesus shows his power, it demands a response. Will the people in Jesus' day, will they respond in faith? Will we respond in faith? And that brings us to Mark chapter 5, our main text today. Now in Mark chapter 5, Jesus has just calmed the sea. And he gets out of the boat and he gets to dry land. And as soon as he gets out of the boat, verse 2, there's this man with an unclean spirit. And he comes out of the tombs and he met Jesus. And Jesus here in the text is faced with another challenge. That demon-possessed man. And we're going to see, is Jesus up for this challenge? Can Jesus answer this man's need here in Mark chapter 5? And we see as the man is described there in verse 3 that he lived in the tombs and no one was able to restrain him anymore, not even with a chain. Because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but had torn the chains apart and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, he among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And if we skip on down, when Jesus asks this man, what is your name? He says, my name is Legion, because we are many. You see, this man here in Mark chapter 5, this demon-possessed man, is not only unclean because he's living among the tombs. This man is seriously demon-possessed. This man is unclean. This man is filled with all these demons. This man needs help. He needs healing. He needs cleansing. And there's only one person who can change that, and that's Jesus. And that's the first example of Jesus' power here in the text, is that we see that Jesus has the power over demons. That Jesus looks here in the text as he's talking to this man, he casts out the demons. We're going to find out in just a second. That Jesus can take these demons that are controlling this man's life and he can get them completely out of his life. And maybe that's where we're at today. Maybe we're here today and we're dealing with a temptation. Maybe we're dealing with a problem in our life. Maybe there's a part of our life that the forces of darkness and the forces of demons and the forces of the devil are controlling our life. Maybe it's that addiction. Maybe it's that sin. Maybe it's a problem in our marriage and it's controlling our life. And we've hit rock bottom, much like this demon-possessed man here in Mark chapter 5. And now we are like that demon-possessed man. We are going to Jesus and we're crying out as he does there in the text, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High?" We're coming to Jesus because that's the only place we can go. We're coming to Jesus and we're kneeling down before Jesus just as this demon-possessed man does. That's what's so shocking about this text, is that this demon-possessed man, this man who's filled with the forces of darkness, recognizes that Jesus is the Son of the Most High God. Of all the people to confess Jesus as Lord in the Gospels, it's a demon-possessed man. In fact, we see that a couple of times in the Gospel of Mark. It's the demon-possessed man. It's the people who are unclean. It's the people who are unworthy, who recognize that Jesus is the Son of God. The Jews, the people who were expecting the Messiah, they don't recognize Jesus as the Most High God. But demons do. Even demons believe and tremble. And even as we read this story and this demon man comes up to Jesus, we're left wondering, what will Jesus do? Does Jesus have the power over these demons? Can he help this man clean up the mess? And the answer, spoiler alert, is yes, he can. With just a word, Jesus casts the demons out of this man's life. And these demons, in a fairly humorous story, go into the pigs, and the pigs run down the hill into the lake, into the sea. That is one of the moments in Jesus' life that I would have loved to witness, seeing a herd of pigs run down into a sea. I think that would have been fun to watch. Maybe you do too. But that's what we see Jesus comes for. Jesus came to set men free from the power of demons. Jesus came to rescue us from the forces of darkness. Guys, that's where we were before Jesus. That's where we were before the gospel. That you and I, we were entrapped. We were controlled by the forces of darkness. You know, we like to think of ourselves as good, upstanding people. After all, we go to church on Sunday. After all, we live a good moral life. After all, you're not going to see our face, at least I don't think you're going to see our face, on America's Most Wanted tonight. But the reality of the situation as we look at our life and what the Bible describes of our situation is that we were controlled by the forces of darkness. We were all sinners. We were all unclean, much like this demon-possessed man. But the good news of the gospel is that Jesus came to clean unclean people. He came to set us free from the forces and the power of the devil. But Jesus didn't set us free to go and hide. Jesus didn't set us free so we could, sit in our rooms and do nothing. Look what he says or tells this demon-possessed man after freeing him from the forces of these demons, after casting out all these demons. He says there in verse 19, when the demon-possessed man wants to stay with Jesus, he says, no. He did not let him, but told him, go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And so he, that's the demon-possessed man, went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And they were all amazed. This demon-possessed man here in Mark chapter 5 was told to go tell others about how Jesus has the power over demons, what Jesus had done for him in casting out all these demons. Guys, it's the same way with us. When Jesus cleans up our mess, when Jesus rescues us from the domain of darkness, it's not so we can sit home and watch Netflix or play Xbox or scroll through Facebook. Jesus rescues us from the domain of darkness so we will tell others about what the Lord has done for us. How Jesus has come into our heart and come into our life and cleansed our heart and made us new again. How he has changed our life. Because even today, Jesus has the power to rescue us from that domain of darkness. He has the power to change our hearts and change our lives. And all we need to do when that happens to us is to tell others about him. But here in Mark chapter 5, as the story continues and unfolds here in Mark chapter 5, Jesus crosses back over the sea. And immediately as he gets across to the other side of the sea, a large crowd is gathered again. And there's a synagogue leader named Jairus. And Jairus is desperate. There in verse 23, he comes up to Jesus and begs him earnestly, "My daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live." It's every parent's worst nightmare. Every parent's worst nightmare is seeing their own child in a casket, their own child on a deathbed. And this man is experiencing it firsthand in his life, and he is desperate. And he knows, I've heard about this Jesus guy. I know he has power. What can he do for my daughter that's on the deathbed? And so Jesus begins to go with them, and there's this large crowd following him, and they're all pressing up against Jesus. But then there's another problem that arises. There in the text, we meet this young woman who's had a bleeding for 12 years, which means for 12 years she couldn't be around people. For 12 years she couldn't worship at the temple. For 12 years she was considered unclean by her Jewish friends. But see, she's Jesus walking. And so she goes up to Jesus there in the text, and in verse 28, she's thinking to herself, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. And so she reaches out there in the text, and she reaches out and she touches Jesus' clothes, and immediately she is healed. And this is the second example of Jesus' power here in the text, is that Jesus has the power over disease. This young lady, as the text tells us, had spent all of her money trying to heal herself from disease. She's gone to doctor after doctor after doctor after doctor, trying to figure out some cure for this disease. How in the world can I be healed? And even though she's drained her savings, even though she's drained her 401k, even though she's drained her pension, she's drained everything she's had trying to find a cure, she doesn't have a cure. And so she, like the demon-possessed man, is desperate. So that's why she comes to Jesus, and she is healed. Now remember, she is also unclean. She's not supposed to be near people. She's not supposed to be surrounded by people. She's not supposed to be in a crowd of people, but there she is, in a crowd of people. And she's reaching out to touch the very Son of God. She's violating all the religious and social norms of the day. All because she wants to be with Jesus. There's a lot to like about this woman here in the text. But I also think it's interesting that as you read Mark chapter 5, the crowd doesn't stop her. The crowd doesn't look at this woman who's unclean. They don't look at this woman who's had this flow of blood. They don't look at this woman who they view as unworthy and say, you're unworthy, get out of here. They don't look at her and go, wait a second, you're unclean, get out of here. They don't look down on her. They don't push her away. But there's also something else I find interesting about this woman. She knows she's unclean. She knows she's had this flow of blood for 12 years. But she also knows that Jesus has the power to make her clean again. And so she goes to Jesus and touches him. And there in verse 30, immediately Jesus realized that the power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? And the disciples look at Jesus and they're like, you see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, who touched me? The vision I have as I think about this text is kind of like that standing room only at a rock concert or a country concert, that right by the stage where everyone's bumping up to each other. And you don't know who just bumped into you, you just know someone did. Everyone's all around Jesus, everyone is bumping and touching each other, and the disciples are like, you're asking us a very silly question. There's a crowd. Of course people are going to be touching you. But the woman, with fear and trembling, knows she's done wrong. She knows she's unclean. And she comes up to Jesus and falls down before him in verse 33 and told him the whole truth. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus has power. And she's unclean. What will happen to her? And Jesus looks to her and says, daughter, in verse 34, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction. Jesus, with this unclean woman, loved her, he cared for her, and he healed her. There's a lot to like about what we see there in the text. Do we have Jesus' attitude in our life? When someone tries to come to Jesus, someone who we may view as undesirable, what do we do? How do we respond? Do we put up walls and build ditches to make it harder for them to get to Jesus? Do we try to push them away? Do we look down on them? Do we want them to get their life together, to get clean before they come to Jesus? That's not what I see here in Mark chapter 5. She comes to Jesus and she's unclean, and Jesus welcomes her in love. Jesus makes her clean. Put yourself in this story for a second. Think about the impact on this woman. She's thinking to herself, she's unclean. I know I'm unclean, but Jesus, the very Son of God, talked to me. Jesus loved me. Jesus has the power to heal me. Think about the impact on her life going forward. Think about the impact on the crowd around Jesus as Jesus talks to this unclean woman. How they went home potentially and told everyone in their life about how Jesus has the power to clean this unclean, this sick woman. Think about the impact on us. I think this story is a powerful reminder for all of us that Jesus came for the unclean. He came for the sick. He came to heal the spiritually sick and make them clean, make them whole again. Jesus has the power to heal us from our sickness. And you know what? Faith in Jesus still saves. Do we have the faith even today that Jesus has the power to heal us from our sickness, whether it's physical or spiritual? That's the question this woman had to answer here in Mark chapter 5. And that's a question I think we need to be able to answer too. Do we honestly believe that Jesus has the power to heal? But the story goes on because Jairus is still there. His daughter's still on her deathbed, and we're wondering what's going to happen to Jairus and his daughter. And while Jesus is still speaking there in verse 35, people come to Jairus and say, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? The woman with the flow of blood must have been thrilled. She's been made clean. In the same moment she's rejoicing that she has been made clean, Jairus is breaking down. His daughter is dead. It's his worst nightmare. It's something he's dreaded. Two people, two completely different emotions. Just a moment earlier, Jairus came to Jesus and he was frantic. Now he finds out it's too little too late. If only Jesus hadn't stopped to talk to this woman. If only Jesus could walk just a little bit faster. If only Jesus got there just a little bit earlier. Now Jairus' daughter is dead. Or so he thinks. And there in verse 36, Jesus overheard this and what was said, and he told the synagogue leader, don't be afraid, verse 36, only believe. Moments earlier, he told that sick woman, your faith has saved you. Now he looks at Jairus and says, just have faith. Just believe. The story isn't over. And Jesus goes on to Jairus' house. He walks in there in verse 39, and he says to the people in Jairus' house, why are you making a commotion and weeping? This child is not dead, but asleep. And they all start laughing. This may have been 2,000 years ago. They may not have had the technology and the machine we see in the hospital and all the hospital TV shows that goes beep, 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 and beep when they're dying. They may not have had that machine, whatever it's called. But they knew dead, and they know Jairus' daughter is dead, so they are laughing. Jesus also knows his daughter is dead. But Jesus also knows this isn't the end of the story. And Jesus is about to show his power over death there in Mark chapter 5. That's the third example of Jesus' power here in the text. Jesus walks into the room. There in verse 41, he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha kum, which is translated, little girl, I said to you, get up. Moments earlier, the woman with the flow of blood reaches out to touch Jesus, and she's healed. Now Jesus touches this unclean, this dead young girl, and says, Talitha kum, daughter, little girl, get up. With just a few words, Jairus' worst fears are defeated. His daughter is raised from the dead. We see a couple of things here with Jesus raising this daughter from the dead that I think are incredibly important for us to remember today as disciples of Christ. That we see here in the text that for Jesus, raising the dead is as easy as waking someone up from a nap. I remember a couple of times as a dad that I've gone in to wake Jackson up from a nap. And it's still fairly easy. You just come in there, turn off his sound machine, and kind of rub his back a little bit. Within a minute or two, he's awake. That's easy for fathers and mothers to do, to wake their child up for a nap. That's how easy it is for Jesus to wake someone up from the dead. But we also see that to Jesus, death is just a temporary setback. For Jesus, death is not the end of the story. All of the pain and all of the suffering is just temporary. And I think that's important for us to remember. Because to Jesus, death can be defeated. It's easy for us to look at death and think death robs us of hope. But when we look to Jesus, we're reminded that death is not the end of the story. When we look to Jesus, we have hope. Some of you are familiar with Sean Cavender and the story that's been circulating online over the last few weeks, how this 36-year-old preacher was in Athens, Alabama for a lectureship. And after the Thursday evening lectureship, which I believe was the last lecture of the week, he's pulling out of the parking lot. Someone runs a red light, and he's killed on the spot. To the world, that looks like a tragedy, and it is. A 36-year-old man leaves behind 2 kids and a wife. That's a tragedy. But we also know that's not the end of the story. Because to us, to Jesus, death is not the end of the story. Death can be defeated. And here in Mark chapter 5, with just a word, Jesus displays his power over death. Can you imagine being in that house that day? And the looks of everyone's face as Jesus comes down the stairs with this young woman who was dead just moments earlier and says, hey, she's a little hungry. Can you give her a snack? Can you imagine being there in the crowd and realizing that Jesus has just raised the dead? All because Jairus believed. Do we have that same belief today? Do we really, truly, honestly believe that Jesus has the power to raise the dead? Seeing Jesus raise this girl here in Mark chapter 5 should cause our fear of death to wash away and strengthen our faith in God, because we know our Savior not only lives, but our Savior has the power over death. Something very interesting here in Mark chapter 5. Something very interesting that I find here in the text. And in many ways, I believe we are the demon-possessed man. That you and I, we have been controlled in our life by the forces of darkness. In many ways, we are the woman with the flow of blood. We are unclean. In many ways, we are like Jairus' daughter. We are dead. But our story is not over because of Jesus. Our story is not over because Jesus has power over death. Our story is not over because Jesus has the power to make us clean. Our story is not over because Jesus has the power to rid us, to rescue us from that domain of darkness. There's something else, one final thought I find really super interesting here in Mark chapter 5. In Mark chapter 5, the demons believe and they tremble. They believe Jesus is the Son of God. There in Mark chapter 5 and verse 34, Jesus says to her, "Your faith, your belief has saved you." When Jairus hears about his dead daughter, Jesus looks at her and says, "Don't be afraid, only believe." Do you believe that Jesus has the power to save you? If you believe that Jesus has the power to save you, to rescue you from that domain of darkness, why do you wait any longer? Jesus stands ready to save you, to rescue even today. If you, like these three people in the story, come to Jesus broken, just as you are, and He stands ready to rescue you even today. If we can help you in any way, please let us know while together we stand and sing.